Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time we're going deep into America's journey in World War I. From hesitant observer to a major player on the world stage. You've given me some great stuff to work with for this deep dive, including excerpts from History That Doesn't Suck. And
Yeah, I gotta say, that podcast really lives up to its name. So instead of just skimming the surface like we did in high school with battles and dates, we're going deeper. We're gonna look at the U.S. military leadership. We're gonna look at the experiences of those first American troops on the Western Front.
it's a period that often gets overlooked. But it's crucial for understanding how America went from, this relatively isolated nation to a global military power. Exactly. And what's really great about the sources is they don't shy away from the human stories, like behind the big events. We're going to meet some incredible figures, including a younger George C. Marshall, before he was the famous World War II general. But first, we're going back to 1915, 2 years before the U.S. enters the war, to a tragic event that really shaped the man who would lead the American Expeditionary Force, General John J. Pershing.
It's a story that shows not only Pershing's strength and stoicism, but also, the depth of his character.
So, August 1915, Pershing is stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas. He's dealing with a volatile situation on the Mexican border, and his wife, Frankie, and their children are living at the Presidio in San Francisco. And then tragedy strikes. There's a fire in their home.
Just a parent's worst nightmare. Pershing loses Frankie and 3 of his 4 children. Only his son Warren survives.
I mean, that's just heartbreaking. The sources describe Pershing collapsing at the sight of their coffins. And to make matters worse, later he finds a letter from Frankie, sent just days before the fire. She talks about all the years they'll have together.
It's incredibly poignant, and it makes you wonder how this event might have shaped Pershing's leadership. Did it make him more driven, more emotionally distant, or maybe more focused on duty and the mission at hand?
It's a question worth thinking about, for sure. And speaking of shaping a legacy, we can't forget about Pershing's nickname, Blackjack.
Oh yeah, it's a nickname that actually started out as a derogatory term, when he was teaching at West Point, because he had commanded black troops, the Buffalo Soldiers.
So it started as an insult, but became a mark of respect.
Exactly. It came to symbolize his toughness and his, unwavering discipline.
So fast forward to 1917, and the U.S. declares war on Germany. And now America has to build an army, and they have to do it fast.
Well, the problem was, America had all this industrial might, but a tiny standing army in 1917, like only 107,641 men, compared to the millions already fighting in Europe.
Talk about a David and Goliath situation. I mean, what kind of logistical nightmares did they face, trying to build an army practically overnight?
Well, just imagine. You got to implement a draft, you got to build training camps, you got to equip an army, and all while dealing with widespread illiteracy among recruits and a mad scramble for supplies. I mean, there are stories of soldiers drilling with broomsticks because they didn't have enough rifles.
That's unbelievable. I could only imagine the chaos. And then, on top of all that, you have soldiers speaking all these different languages, trying to understand orders, communicate with each other.
Yeah, it was a melting pot, to say the least. But it really shows the determination and resourcefulness that went into building this army from scratch.
And of course, wars are expensive.
Yeah.
How did Congress pay for all of this? I'm guessing it wasn't just a bake sale.
No, not quite. They had to get creative. Congress raised income taxes a lot, especially for the wealthiest Americans. They called it conscription of wealth. Basically, a way to mobilize not just manpower, but also financial resources for the war effort.
Conscription of wealth, that's a striking term. Is that controversial at the time?
Oh, absolutely. Some people thought it was government overreach. Others saw it as necessary to spread the burden of war fairly. It's something we could spend a whole other deep dive on.
I think you're right. It's fascinating to see how wartime can change government policy and public opinion. But let's get back to Pershing. He gets to France with his first troops, and he immediately faces pressure from the British and French.
Yeah, the Allies were desperate. Their armies were exhausted after years of fighting. They saw the fresh American troops as a lifeline. They pushed for what they called amalgamation, basically integrating American soldiers into their existing units.
I can see why Pershing wasn't thrilled about that idea. He had his own vision for the American Expeditionary Force.
Right. He wanted an independent American force, able to operate under its own command. He had orders from President Wilson to keep it a separate and distinct component within the Allied forces.
So he didn't want American soldiers just thrown into the meat grinder.
Exactly. He wanted to make sure they were trained and equipped before being sent to the Western Front. He also understood the symbolism of an independent American force.
It sounds like he was in a tough spot,
Wow.
balancing the needs of the Allies with his vision for the AEF. And then in November 1917, something happens, something that really brings the war home for the Americans.
The first American combat deaths. During a German trench raid, it wasn't a huge battle, but it was incredibly significant.
Because it was a turning point, right, both for public opinion back home and for how involved America would be.
Exactly. These were the first American soldiers to die fighting under the American flag in this war.
Wow.
And there are some chilling details about that raid. Like, there's a German soldier who spoke perfect English. He used that to get close to the Americans before attacking.
It just shows the brutal reality of trench warfare. It wasn't all parades and speeches like when the AEF arrived.
Speaking of parades, we should talk about that famous 4th of July parade in Paris. The big red one, the 1st Division, marched through the city and gave a speech at Lafayette's tomb.
That's where the line, Lafayette, we are here, comes from. It's a powerful symbol of America's commitment to France. But at this point, the AEF was still more symbols than substance.
It was a powerful symbol, though. It showed the world America was in the fight, and it gave a morale boost to the Allies. But behind the scenes, they were still struggling to equip and train everyone.
So they were very much a work in progress. And as we'll see in part 2, things are going to change drastically, which puts even more pressure on Pershing and the AEF.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so last time we talked about the AEF,
Yeah.
finding its feet in France. More like a symbolic force than a true fighting force, right?
Mhm.
But in 1918, things changed. A big shakeup. That really tested Pershing and forced some tough choices. What happened?
Well, the Russian Revolution changed everything. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, they took over, and basically, they wanted out of the war, like yesterday. They signed a peace treaty with Germany. In March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk.
So Germany could suddenly move a ton of troops.
Yeah.
From the Eastern Front to the Western Front? That must have been terrifying for the Allies. I mean, they were already exhausted.
It was a huge setback. Germany launched a massive offensive, the Spring Offensive. They wanted to break through the Allied lines before the Americans could get there in force.
So that's why the pressure on Pershing was so intense. The Allies were desperate. They needed those fresh American troops.
Oh, absolutely. They begged Pershing to give in, to let them use the American troops however they needed. They said the war could be lost if he didn't.
But Pershing held firm. He didn't want to give up his vision of an independent American force. Plus, he didn't want to risk huge casualties with inexperienced soldiers.
It was a tough spot for sure.
So what was Pershing's game plan here? Was he just being stubborn?
I think it was more strategic than that. He knew that by waiting, America would have more leverage. When the war ended, they would have a stronger voice at the negotiating table.
It was a gamble, though, wasn't it? He was basically playing chicken with the future of entire nations.
It all came down to this meeting, the Supreme War Council in May 1918. You can imagine the tension in the room, Pershing against the British and French prime ministers, and the Allied Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch.
And they wanted him to hand over American troops.
They proposed that American troops arriving in June be sent wherever they were needed most, no matter what.
And Pershing said no.
Flat out refused, he said, and I'm quoting here, "I will not be coerced."
Wow. What a power move. Did he storm out of the room after that?
Maybe not a literal mic drop moment, but he understood the optics. By taking a stand, even risking alienating the Allies, he put America on the world stage.
A bold move, considering how bad things were on the front lines.
Yeah.
So did Pershing ever cave?
He did, but in his own way. At the end of May, he offered some divisions to the French,
No.
including 4 regiments of black soldiers, but that's a whole other deep dive. Then he met with General Foch and said, "Infantry, artillery, aviation, all that we have is yours. Use them as you please."
Wow. So he was buying time for the AEF
Yeah.
by showing that America was committed.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how complex Pershing was as a leader. He was strict, yes, but also a brilliant strategist. He was fiercely protective of America, but also willing to make sacrifices for the greater good.
So where was George C. Marshall during all of this?
Oh, he was working behind the scenes as Pershing's right-hand man, helping with logistics, training, deployments. This is where he really honed his organizational skills and earned his reputation for efficiency.
So even with all the chaos, you could see the future leaders emerging.
It's amazing how these individual stories are intertwined with the bigger picture of history.
It is.
This period was a crucible for many American officers who would later be important in World War II and even beyond. And it all goes back to that fire in 1915. It makes you think about how Pershing's personal loss might have fueled his determination to make sure that the sacrifices of American soldiers wouldn't be in vain.
It's a powerful thought. But the story of the AEF isn't over yet. They've trained, they've arrived, they've even offered troops. But now it's time to see them in action. What happens next? Last time we were talking about the AEF getting bigger and Pershing, trying to navigate the politics of the war. But at some point, the training had to stop. The strategizing had to stop. They had to actually fight. So when did the AEF really get into the action?
Well, their first real test was in late May 1918 at a place called Cantigny. You probably haven't heard of it. It's not as famous as some of the later battles, but it was important.
Cantigny, why was that battle so important?
Because it was the first time American troops led an offensive on their own. Yeah, it was a smaller operation, but symbolically it was huge. It showed everyone, the Allies, the Germans, even themselves, that the Americans could fight and win.
I bet that was a big morale boost for the troops
Yeah.
and for people back home. Did this win lead to the AEF getting involved in bigger things?
Absolutely. Cantigny showed everyone they weren't messing around, and it set the stage for some much bigger battles and much more brutal battles in the next few months, like Belleau Wood, which you mentioned earlier.
Oh, yeah, Belleau Wood. I remember that from history class. It was a really tough battle, right?
Yeah, really tough. It was a dense forest, which made the fighting really fierce, a lot of hand-to-hand combat. The Marines really earned their reputation there.
I read about the Marines charging into machine gun fire, yelling, "Come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" That's intense.
Yeah, that quote is famous for a reason. It really captures the spirit of the Marines at Belleau Wood. They were ferocious, and their sacrifices were a big part of stopping the Germans.
And all this is happening while the Allies are pushing back, right? Like the tide is turning after months of being on the defensive.
Right, and the AEF is playing a bigger and bigger role. What's interesting is that even as the Americans are proving themselves, Pershing is still fighting for that independence. He's trying to support the Allies, but also not let the U.S. just become part of their armies.
So he never gave up on that idea of an independent American force.
Nope, not at all. He was sure the AEF needed to be its own thing, able to operate on its own. And as the war went on, he got what he wanted. By the fall of 1918, the AEF had over 2 million men. And they were fighting under their own command in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive.
The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, that was the biggest and deadliest battle in American history up to that point, right?
It was a massive operation. Over 1 million American troops, brutal fighting, terrible casualties. But in the end, the AEF broke through the German lines, and that helped force Germany to negotiate.
So, a victory, but a really costly one.
Yeah.
The AEF showed what they could do, but a lot of people paid the price.
Yeah, war is always costly, but the AEF's sacrifices helped the Allies win. And it really set the stage for America becoming a world power.
And it all comes back to Pershing, that image of him, stoic, disciplined, facing incredible personal tragedy, dealing with political pressure, and leading the AEF to victory.
It's an amazing story about leadership, about resilience, about the complicated nature of war. It's something that still has meaning today. It reminds us of the challenges and sacrifices that come with shaping history.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the early days of America's involvement in World War I. We've covered so much: personal stories, politics, logistical problems, and incredible bravery on the battlefield. It's been quite a journey.
It really has, and I hope you, our listeners, have learned something new about this important time. This is a period that shaped America's role in future wars and its place in the world.
Yeah, and if you're listening, we want to hear from you. What surprised you? What stuck with you? What questions do you still have about this time in history? Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.